presently 3 a.m. And that is my favorite time of the day.
About 5 years ago, I decided that I was going to start playing catch up. You might be thinking, on what? Well, everything, pretty much. The things from before I was born. The things from before my parents and grandparents were born. The things from when I was growing up, but I was decidedly too young for them.
It's like I consume all this crap and I have so many thoughts about it, about books, about movies, about games, about TV shows, comics, all of it, and most of the time I guess I just end up talking to myself. There's 5 things that I love more than anything else in the world. Music, video games, music in video games, catching up on crap, and running my mouth about the other 4 things. Now, it wasn't always like this. I pretty much was always interested in music and games, but I wasn't really interested in stuff that wasn't actively coming out until pretty recently. And to get some context on that, we're going to have to take a little trip into the past.
The year was 2015. I just graduated high school and we'd moved from Charlotte to Southern California, as we are wont to do. I came back one day from exploring the trails out there, and my little brother was in the living room playing this game that looked and sounded 8-bit, but with a little extra. Now, of course, I didn't really care about indie games or retro stuff at that point in my life, and so I kind of brushed it off. Little did I know that very game was going to throw some seismic ripples through my life.
That game was Shovel Knight, and it marked something of a 0 AD in my life. It was the game that gave me a greater appreciation for indie titles, but more importantly than that, it was the game that introduced me to the wonders of the 80s. Video games first. And those 80s games in turn would serve as the rabbit hole that I'd go down and discover pretty much everything else that came out before I was born.
To give the broad strokes, you're a knight with a shovel going to the Tower of Fate to rescue your friend who's a knight with a shield. On the way there, you're going to traverse plains, graveyards, tundra, towers, volcanoes, haunted mansions to achieve that singular purpose. But it's not going to be that easy, because standing in your way is the Order of No Quarter. 8 knights residing in lairs, matching their themes, each wielding appropriate powers that you can, to an extent, claim for yourself with magical items. There's townspeople, a smithy, a giant magical fish god that grants you boons, all your typical adventure RPG stuff.
One of the big things that appealed to a lot of people about Shovel Knight right from the start was that it took all these things that were great about the 80s games and threw them in a blender. See, now for me, I didn't appreciate that aspect of it initially because those games came out a decade before I was born, and so I didn't know anything about them, And then once I finally played those games, it was this big moment like, oh, that's where that comes from. See, it's kind of like in middle school, we had this guy who would do the morning announcements. He had this soundboard with all these different sound effects, and one sound effect was Will Smith from the first Men in Black saying, "I make this look good." And when I finally saw the movie and saw that quote in context, it was the biggest moment of clarity I had had in my life up to that point. It's not really relevant. I go on tangents a lot. Sorry about that.
I'm sure there's hundreds of videos about this exact topic, but I don't think you can overstate it enough. To be fair though, I was familiar with a couple of these games beforehand. Like, of course, the famous map screen system from Mario 3, or the magic meter and collectible items from Zelda and Zelda 2. Although the idea of this cheapskate hiding out in treasure chests to sell you your own find is a little ironic to me. It's like, think about it. In any other game, when you find a treasure chest, what happens? You open it and you get what's inside, right? In this game, you open the treasure chest and a jackass pops out trying to sell you the treasure. It's like, okay, technically he found the treasure first. Yeah, so it's technically his. But imagine how much of a jerk you have to be to do this. And think about how hard you have to commit to being a jerk. To say to yourself, okay, I'm gonna hide out in this treasure chest until some hapless, stupid adventurer comes along, thinking that they're gonna get some treasure for free, and then I'm gonna pop out like, hey man, you wanna buy this off of me? Come on. Then of course, there's all the influences I didn't know about, like the pogo thing from DuckTales, which, once I got around to playing it, was somehow really difficult for me. There's the exploding walls and shifting screens from Castlevania, as well as finding meat in the walls. There's all these nice little references to scenes from other old games. And then there's the fact that the format of the entire game is lifted directly off of Mega Man, right down to the Battle Royale against all the masters at the end. Although having the option to save them and quote-unquote turn them to your side is really, really cool. Then there's less obvious things, like for example using the sub-weapons uses the same controls as Castlevania, even though modern controllers have more than enough buttons for sub-weapons to get their own button. Or how you see the same enemies as the game goes on, but as you progress, they start to get attacks they didn't have initially. I associate that with Contra, but I'm sure other games did it too. Or those frickin' mutant flying bunny things that deliberately attack you from a diagonal angle, making it impossible to hit them, which was a thing in a number of older games. The beating heart of Shovel Knight though, and something that has apparently come to define Yacht Club's games, are all those little things. Like for example, there's something I find really funny about the fact that you can't wake up without jumping. And if you try to do anything else, Shovel Knight just kinda jitters around. It makes me think about those times when you're trying to wake up in real life and you're conscious but you can't move or even open your eyes. And imagine if that was you. Imagine if in order to wake up you had to jump 10 feet in the air every time. How many people would hit their heads every day? Imagine how much of a necessity helmets would be. Imagine how well they'd sell. No wonder everybody's a knight in this game. You gotta love all the pointless interactions in the town too. Like the kid who's like, I'm the fastest! And of course, you immediately try to outrun him because your brain is programmed to take a statement like that as a challenge and expect a reward after, and of course nothing happens and you feel like an idiot, if you're like me. I love how the Troupple Acolyte's text waves back and forth when you hail the Troupple King with him. It doesn't crackle and jitter like a lot of excited text, it flows. It's elegant. And plus, I'm just a sucker for interactions like this in games. It's like, if you're like me and you explored the whole town when you first went, then by this point in the game, you don't even know who the Troupple King is, or if he even exists. You just go along with this seemingly crazy guy, and you just rile him up even more. Honestly, this dance is one of my favorite things in any game ever. This energetic tarantella in the background, the bass leading that happens in it. How the barmaid gets so into it as she swings the towel around, the fact that the dancer knocks you out of the way with the vigor of the dance, everything about this scene is just the absolute best. That final twirl animation always makes me so happy.
I've tried to find some kind of confirmation of it, but I really can't. This is a Final Fantasy IV reference, right?
It's the non-functional things that really help make the game what it is. For example, I liked running around in the gold armor. Yeah, it's got no function, but who doesn't like spinning jumps and sparkles? That is until I found out that you could fight the goddamn ghost of Sparta himself in this game and get the Shovel of Chaos. Of course I gotta talk about the Kratos boss fight since I'm playing the PlayStation version. When I found out this fight was in the game, I kinda freaked out. I've been a huge fan of God of War since I was 14. It was my introduction to QuickTime cinematic sequences and M-rated games, hack and slash and gore, all kinds of stuff that I love to this day. And the soundtrack in those games, top notch. So, of course, the version of that classic main theme that plays in this game is the good stuff. It's the real good stuff. The awesomeness of this cameo blew me away. And that was before I knew that Kratos himself gives you an item that essentially gives you his powers. It even lets you hover when you attack in midair, just like in his games. You jump on his head and he runs away faster, like, please don't hurt me anymore. Idiot.
Kratos, the god killer, who by this point had eliminated most of the pantheon, beat back the hands of death, slew the sisters of fate, and I guess by this point had beaten Hercules' face to a pulp because he already has the gauntlets, is afraid of a guy with a shovel. I've heard floating around in the nebulous ether of the internet somewhere that this fight is actually canonical, and if that's true, then Shovel Knight's on a whole other tier of power. But anyways, that's the game in a nutshell, and as if all that awesomeness weren't enough, I haven't even mentioned what's basically the centerpiece of the reason that I'm making this video. A soundtrack so bombastically badass that when I first heard it, I was musically traumatized. It redefined what I thought was possible in video game music.
Shovel Knight's soundtrack was the thing that contextualized not only video game history for me, but video game musical history as well. And I want to talk a little bit about that because the soundtrack's use of old and new things, like fundamental compositional sound things, was something that went over my head when I first played it. But now it's a really important part of how I'm coming to understand everything else.
It's so important to me that I actually wrote my term paper on it this past semester. And that paper got an A.
I mean, just look at all these books. I did some actual research for this.
Yeah, believe it or not, just because it was a video game paper doesn't mean it wasn't well researched. And yes, it was difficult to find scholarly books written about video game music. It's unfortunate, but I'm holding the entirety of our library's books on video game music in my one hand. But I'm going to share some of that research with you all, because I figure if anybody's going to care, it's whoever's watching this video.
My basic point was that Shovel Knight hails from two musical game traditions, the chiptunes of the 1980s and the bigger orchestral stuff with diegetic silence of modern games. When I first sat down to write the paper, I had no idea what diegetic meant. Of course, I know now that it refers to in-game silence, like, Bloodborne or Shadow of the Colossus, for example. Again, there's probably a million videos about this, but context is important. Audio in earlier games was important because it had to create an atmosphere beyond what graphics were capable of. And to this extent, many newer games that are more visually realistic use music sparsely, or not at all, as a way of creating a more realistic world. Since, you don't hear music walking around in real life. Because there was this limited capacity for audio, 1980s and 90s game composers often employed archetypal, classic, and operatic cues. As well as popular musical trends. To easily convey moods. You had to clearly convey the music back then.
Maybe the coolest thing that I came away with in terms of this research was Nintendo's influence on video game making, suggesting that something could still be playful and silly and colorful, and still be art at the same time.
Roger Mosley and Aya Saiki wrote a fascinating article about the Japanese way of play, an approach to game making popularized by Nintendo in the 80s and embodied by the games of the time. They discuss Kareta Gijutsu no Suihei Shiko, which translates roughly to lateral thinking with seasoned or withered technology, which was about older objects that are being reworked to seem as new rather than starting all the way over again with newer stuff. That idea has always permeated Nintendo's hardware and game design, with more an emphasis on fun and vibrancy.
A lot of the realizations I came to on my own are things that other people have written about. For example, the things that Nintendo and Sony and Microsoft all brought to the table. Nintendo's more focused on the fun and the mechanics of the game. Sony brought cinematic elements to the conversation, and Microsoft revolutionized the role of the internet in video games. And it was cool to think about that, especially in the context of where those companies originally came from.
Michael Dierico writes that indie games are often characterized by a prominence of game rules and mechanics, an awareness that the game is a game, as opposed to a simulation of real life. In the end, Mosley and Psyche make the point that Japanese art has for a while been intertwined with playfulness, and aims to directly bridge the functional and the decorative. Yeah, video games are mainly toys and meant as vehicles for fun, but in the Japanese tradition that was not an indictment against art, but rather the two are connected. My paper was about how Shovel Knight took these two camps of thought to school at the same time and made them work together, which to me is still an absolutely amazing feat. Right from the beginning, it throws you into this slideshow opening, not rare for an NES game, but the programmatic nature of the scoring is beyond almost anything I've seen from the 80s thus far. There's the obvious thing, the use of chiptunes, which aren't technically necessary, but they're a big part of the retro appeal. Like classic games, the music in each level is like a microcosm of the world. I already mentioned how much this game borrows from Mega Man, and this is one of the big ways, with the night, the lair, and the music all themed together. You know, 1,000 Leagues, for example, gives you the different thematic aspects of the Iron Whale. You know, you get the mellow, warmer synths, which have become kind of archetypal of water levels, and the harsh percussion blending together. Shovel Knight's number one purpose is fun, like a toy, hence all the non-functional stuff that I mentioned earlier. For example, the duck. This duck mystified a lot of people because it doesn't change your hitbox and provides no gameplay benefit whatsoever. According to Yacht Club Games' official website, however, this duck does serve a purpose, to remind the player of the toyish nature of games. According to them, it provides humor as you duck to match the NPCs or duck wildly when a conversation gets too dry. It's cute, and it shows the game is a little silly and shouldn't be taken too seriously. You can use it to participate during dances too. But most importantly, it does something that old Nintendo games did so well. It reminds you of the toyish nature of a game.
Honestly, how could you resist dancing to the music in this game?
The composer Jake Kaufman has what I always thought was a unique cameo in this game as the bard. You give him the sheet music and he plays songs for you, as well as giving you some funny fourth wall one-liners. It also gives you some cool insight into how modern and retro sound design come together in the game. For example, when asked about Strike the Earth, the track for the game's heroic first level, the bard replies, ostinato trumpet triplets. Is there anything you can't render into pure magic? The funny thing being, there are no trumpets, just synths meant to serve the purpose of trumpets.
See, that's what's so cool to me. In using all these different kinds of textures and timbres and, different types of chiptunes, this game manages to sound both like a classic NES game with limited channels and all that kind of stuff, and also like a big modern symphony. It's literally both at the same time. I mean, come on, the God of War theme alone.
Then the bard will make this cryptic comment that he got a couple of his songs from another bard, who he says was writing heroic tunes long before he was. I found out a while ago that he was actually talking about Manami Matsume, who composed the music for Mega Man decades ago, and wrote 2 songs as a guest on Shovel Knight's soundtrack.
When I found this out, I felt the strangest and largest combination of jealousy and motivation that I had ever felt in my life. See, my ultimate goal is to write music for video games, to be a, video game composer. And so when I found out, not only did you write one of the coolest game soundtracks of all time, but you got to do it while working with one of the women who was literally a progenitor for the entire genre. You know, that'd be like if one day I sat down to do some freelance work for, I don't know, for Square Enix or somebody, and I got to work with Yoko Shimomura. Like, I can dream.
So then finally, there's the programmatic stuff, by which I mean music that intentionally tells a story, which in older games was more common in RPGs, but in newer games is pretty par for the course most of the time, because this is something that you associate more with orchestral stuff. Kingdom Hearts was my first and maybe biggest exposure to this kind of stuff, and then later on Zelda, and we'll definitely talk about those in later episodes. There's several examples. You know, of course, there's the Plains theme, which is basically your main theme. Your rival, the Black Knight, gets bits of it in both versions of his music, although I'm playing gender swapped, so it's her version. There's Shield Knight's theme, which you hear during the opening with the sharp 5 to make it sound, you know, kind of trippy and whole tony. And you hear it several points throughout, because he's Shovel Knight's motivation. You hear it during the Starlit Wilds, your resting points between the levels. And you hear it during his eponymous Requiem, where you have those dream sequences where you catch him, which basically reflect the ending where you catch him for real. You can even hear it a little bit during the Queen Knight fight, for like a split second, which I always thought was awesome, because she's basically the first knight you fight, and the music is so frantic. So it's almost like, hey, you're doing good, champ, stay focused, but don't forget the reason you're doing all this.
We've gotten used to this kind of writing in video games, because over the past several years, a lot of, big budget, critically acclaimed games have started to mirror movies, and movies have been doing that kind of thing in their music for a long time. But in the 80s, as far as I've played, and I haven't played everything, but, that kind of writing was rare in those sort of games. So I put this in camp with the newer stuff.
Then there's the title screen theme that basically serves as your overture. It's the first thing you hear in the game, it's the last thing you hear as you finally climb the lair and you get inside of it. And then, of course, it's also what you hear playing over the credits at the end with that really cool solo. As the game ends and you save Shield Knight for real, bringing your poignant dream sequences full circle, the true final boss manifests and you gear up for a fight that, my first time through this game, was the stuff of nightmares. But this time around as the Ghost of Shovels, it took me about 20 seconds. So you beat it, the castle crumbles, and...
Wait. What the hell? That's how it ends? He dies? Okay. This is not my first time through this game. I'm playing it again for the sake of this video. But I don't remember this happening. I could have sworn the ending was happy.
The credits take you through a musical recap of the entire game. Creating a cohesive medley is an impressive feat to me. Always has been, because linking a bunch of pieces of music that were originally written independently of one another is actually pretty difficult to do. I mean, I've sat down and tried on a number of occasions, and most of them turned out pretty crappy, and the ones that didn't were also not very good.
So, that's the game. Awesome in every way. I can't talk about Shovel Knight enough. And that's without even getting into the DLC, which, each one of those DLCs is the size of the main game, so maybe we'll get to that another episode. The point is, Shovel Knight was the beginning for me, and that's why we're starting with it. There's a lot more to catch up on, so maybe you'll consider joining me.